The day he burned the will, the entire town was already watching. It was late October, the kind of afternoon when the sky over the fields hangs low and gray, pressing down on the earth like an old memory that refuses to lift. The harvest had been poor that year. The corn stood brittle and thin across the Sharma family farmland, dry leaves scraping against each other in the wind like whispers no one wanted to claim. They had gathered outside the old brick house at the edge of the property. The house had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather. Its walls were stained with decades of monsoon rain and summer dust. The paint had peeled in long curls, exposing wood that had darkened with age. A folding table had been set up in the yard for the reading of the will. Plastic chairs creaked under the weight of distant relatives who had not visited in years but had come now, drawn by the gravity of land. Raghav stood apart from them, near the rusted hand pump that hadn't worked in a decade. He wore his father's old brown jacket, the sleeves slightly too short, the collar worn smooth. His face looked carved, as if something inside him had hardened overnight. He had not slept. The lawyer from the district town cleared his throat and unfolded the document with slow, deliberate movements, aware of the silence pressing around him. The farmland stretched behind them, 12 acres of soil that had fed 3 generations. It was not rich land. It demanded more than it gave. But in a small town like Bharavpur, land was not measured in yield. It was measured in memory, in obligation. When the lawyer finished reading, there was a pause long enough for the wind to move through the dry stalks and rattle the loose tin sheet on the cowshed. The will was simple: the house and 10 acres to Raghav, the eldest son, 2 acres and a modest sum of money to his younger sister Mira, who had married into another village. Nothing unusual, nothing controversial. The kind of division people expected. Raghav stepped forward without speaking. He asked for the document. The lawyer hesitated but handed it over. The paper trembled slightly in Raghav's hand, not from the wind, but from something internal, tightly restrained. For a moment he simply looked at it. His father's signature sat at the bottom of the page. It was shaky, uneven. A signature made in the final weeks of a long illness. The crowd shifted, waiting for gratitude, perhaps a speech about honoring his father's wishes. Instead, Raghav walked to the center of the yard where a metal drum sat filled with dry leaves. Someone had burned trash in it the night before. The embers were still alive beneath the ash. His mother rose from her chair. "Raghav," she said quietly, a warning wrapped in a plea. He did not answer. He crouched, struck a match against the side of the drum, and held the flame to the corner of the will. For a second, nothing happened. Then the paper caught. The fire moved quickly, curling the edges inward, blackening his father's name first. Gasps spread through the relatives like a ripple through shallow water. "What are you doing?" Mira stood up so suddenly her chair fell backward. "Have you lost your mind?" Raghav watched until the entire document turned to ash. He did not blink. The smoke rose in a thin column, twisting into the gray sky. When the last fragment collapsed into itself, he stood and faced them. "I won't take it," he said. His voice was steady, not loud, but steady enough to carry. The lawyer stammered something about legal consequences, about certified copies, about procedure. An uncle muttered that grief had driven him mad. Someone whispered that he must have made a private arrangement already. Suspicion began its quiet work. His mother's face had gone pale. She clutched the edge of her shawl so tightly her knuckles whitened. She did not cry. She simply stared at him as though she were looking at a stranger standing where her son used to be. "This land," Raghav said slowly, choosing each word as if it cost him something, "is not ours to divide." The sentence hung there incomplete. A tractor passed on the road beyond the fields, its engine loud against the stillness. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds, indifferent to the rupture that had just occurred. Mira stepped closer to him. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Baba worked this soil his whole life. Dadaji before him. What do you mean it's not ours?" Raghav's eyes shifted toward the far end of the farmland, toward a patch near the old neem tree where the earth always seemed darker. He did not explain. Instead, he said something that unsettled them more than the fire had. "He knew," Raghav murmured. "At the end, he knew." "Knew what?" His mother whispered, but Raghav did not answer. He walked past them, past the folding chairs and the overturned one at Mira's feet, and headed toward the fields. The dry stalks brushed against his jacket as he entered the farmland that, by law and blood, should now have been his. The relatives did not follow. They watched from the yard as he made his way toward the neem tree. The wind picked up, bending the corn slightly, as if the land itself were reacting to his presence. When he reached the tree, he stopped. He stood there for a long time, looking down at the soil. From a distance, it appeared as though he were listening. Back in the yard, the lawyer gathered his briefcase in nervous silence. Mira helped her mother sit down again. No one spoke of calling the police. No one mentioned making a new copy of the will, because what unsettled them was not the destruction of paper. It was the certainty in Raghav's voice. The farmland had been in their family for over 50 years. The deeds were registered. The taxes paid. The boundaries marked by stone and memory. And yet, as the smoke from the burned will thinned into the sky, a question settled over Bharavpur like an approaching storm. If the land was not theirs to divide, then whose was it? 34 years earlier, the farmland looked wider. In the early 1990s, before the borewell dried and before the highway cut through the neighboring village, the fields of Bharavpur still carried a kind of patient optimism. The monsoon arrived almost on time. The soil, though stubborn, still responded to faith. Raghav was 8 that year, thin legs, dusty knees, always trailing a few steps behind his father. His father, Devendra Sharma, was not yet the silent man he would become in later years. Back then, his back was straight, his voice carried across the fields without effort. He believed in the rhythm of seasons, in the arithmetic of sowing and reaping. He believed that if a man worked hard enough, the land would not betray him. The neem tree at the far end of the farmland was younger then, its trunk not yet thick enough to hide a grown man behind it. Beside it stood a wooden boundary post, half buried in soil. Devendra had placed it there himself. He had told Raghav that a boundary post was like a promise. You said it once, and you defend it quietly for the rest of your life. That year, something else arrived on the land. It came wrapped in an old cotton cloth, tied with a red thread. Devendra carried it home one evening without explanation. He placed it inside the iron trunk in his bedroom, the same trunk that held wedding photographs, ration cards, and a small bundle of cash for emergencies. Raghav noticed because children notice what adults think they have hidden. The trunk was heavy, painted green decades earlier. Its hinges creaked like an old throat clearing itself before speaking. Raghav had often been scolded for touching it. But that evening the cloth-wrapped object made a different sound when placed inside, a dull metallic weight. Later that night, when the kerosene lamp flickered and his mother Meenakshi was in the kitchen, Raghav watched his father sit on the edge of the bed and unwrap the cloth again. Inside was a brass survey marker. It was circular, slightly tarnished, engraved with a government seal and a number. A thin iron spike protruded from its base, meant to be driven into the ground to mark official measurement. Devendra turned it over in his hand as if it were fragile, as if it carried something more than metal. Raghav did not understand what it meant, only that his father stared at it the way he sometimes stared at the horizon before a storm. The next morning, Devendra left before sunrise. He told Meenakshi he was going to meet someone from the Tehsil office. His tone was casual, too casual. That afternoon, a jeep was seen parked near the dirt road by their fields, a government jeep. 2 men stepped out with rolled maps under their arms. They walked along the edges of the farmland, counting paces, pushing measuring rods into the earth. Devendra walked beside them, nodding, speaking in low tones. From the courtyard, Meenakshi watched with her hands wet from washing rice. Something in her posture stiffened, but she said nothing. In small towns, official vehicles carry their own kind of rumor. By evening, 3 neighbors had casually passed by to ask whether there was a new irrigation scheme coming. Devendra smiled and deflected. "Just paperwork," he said. "Routine correction." But that night the brass marker did not return to the trunk. Instead, Devendra took Raghav with him to the neem tree. The sun had already dipped, leaving the sky bruised purple. He carried a spade and the marker wrapped again in cloth. "Hold the lantern steady," he told the boy. Raghav obeyed, his small hands trembling as insects circled the light. Devendra dug quietly, not very deep. The soil near the neem tree was darker, slightly moist even in dry months. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, though the air was cool. "Land remembers," he said suddenly, without looking at Raghav. The boy blinked. "Remembers what?" Devendra paused, then shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about." He placed the brass marker into the hole but did not hammer it down as it was meant to be. Instead, he laid it flat as though hiding it rather than planting it. Then he covered it carefully with soil, patting the earth smooth with deliberate hands. "Why are we burying it?" Raghav asked. Devendra's jaw tightened slightly. "Some things are better kept quiet." There was no anger in his voice, only fatigue. In the weeks that followed, subtle shifts moved through the household. Devendra began keeping accounts more meticulously. He visited the Tehsil office twice more. Once, he returned with mud on his shoes that was not from their own fields. Meenakshi noticed but did not question him directly. Instead, she began folding away old documents from the trunk and tying them separately with twine. One afternoon, an older man from the neighboring hamlet came to speak with Devendra. They stood near the cowshed, voices low but urgent. Raghav, pretending to search for a lost marble, heard fragments. "Not right. 30 years ago. Paper can say anything. But soil knows." When the man left, Devendra stood still for a long time, staring at the boundary post near the neem tree. That night he drank more than usual. It was not something he did often, but when he did it in silence. He did not shout. He did not break things. He simply withdrew into himself as if measuring something invisible. Raghav began to associate the neem tree with tension, with adult conversations that stopped when children approached, with his mother's longer silences at dinner. Years passed. The survey marker remained buried. The boundary post leaned slightly but was never straightened. The land yielded crops. Life moved forward in its ordinary cycles of school fees, weddings, hospital visits, and festivals. But sometimes, late at night, Raghav would wake to the sound of the iron trunk opening. He would hear the creak of hinges, the rustle of paper, the faint metallic touch of something being turned over in careful hands. And once, only once, he heard his father whisper into the dark as if confessing to someone who was not there. "A man can inherit land," Devendra murmured softly. "But he cannot inherit innocence." Raghav did not understand the sentence then. He only understood that something had shifted in the soil beneath the neem tree. Something placed there not to mark ownership, but to bury doubt. By the time Raghav turned 25, the farmland no longer looked wide. The highway had come, not directly through their property, but close enough to change its value. Brokers from the nearby town began appearing every few months, stepping out of polished cars in dusty shoes, speaking in numbers that sounded unreal. They measured land not in seasons, but in square feet. They spoke of warehouses, petrol pumps, future development. Devendra listened to them without expression. He never invited them inside. He stood at the edge of the courtyard and let them finish their rehearsed optimism before saying the same sentence each time. "This land feeds us. It is not for sale." But feeding them had become harder. The monsoons grew unreliable. 2 consecutive years of weak rain left cracks in the soil deep enough to swallow a hand. The borewell coughed more air than water. Fertilizer prices climbed. Crop prices did not. Debt entered quietly. First, it was a small loan from the cooperative bank, manageable, practical. Then another when Mira's wedding had to be arranged sooner than expected. Devendra refused to compromise on her marriage. He sold 2 buffaloes instead of reducing the guest list. "Respect is not negotiable," he said. But the loan remained. Raghav had finished his degree in the district town by then. He could have stayed there, taken a job in a private firm, rented a small room with other graduates. But he returned to Bharavpur instead. Returned to the cracking soil and the unfinished sentences hanging around the neem tree. He did not return only out of duty. He returned because he had started to understand the weight in his father's silences. The iron trunk was older now, its green paint almost completely gone. Devendra kept the key on a string around his neck. He no longer opened it at night, but he guarded it with a vigilance that felt disproportionate to the few documents it supposedly contained. One evening, during the 3rd year of poor harvest, the bank manager came in person. A courteous man with a pressed shirt and an apologetic tone. He spoke of repayment schedules and restructuring. He spoke of auction notices in a voice that pretended not to carry threat. Raghav stood beside his father during the conversation. He noticed how Devendra's fingers pressed against the wooden arm of the chair, digging into it slightly. After the manager left, Devendra did something he had never done before. He walked straight to the iron trunk. He opened it in front of Raghav. Inside were neatly bundled land deeds, tax receipts, and the usual official papers. but beneath them, wrapped again in faded cotton cloth, lay the brass survey marker. It had grown darker with age. The engraved government seal was still visible, though partly scratched. Raghav felt his chest tighten. "You remember this?" Devendra asked quietly. "Yes," Raghav said. Devendra held the marker in his palm like a confession. "Do you know what this is?" "A boundary marker." Devendra nodded slowly. "Official boundary marker. Issued when land is measured and recorded." Raghav waited. "The day it was issued," Devendra continued, "the measurement changed." The room felt smaller. Changed how? Raghav asked. Devendra did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked to the window. The fields stretched out in fading evening light, their edges blurred by distance. 34 years ago," he said, "when your grandfather died, there was confusion in the records. Old survey maps, handwritten entries. The neighboring family, the Yadavs, claimed that 1 acre near the neem tree had always been theirs." Raghav felt something shift inside him. "I remember old Yadavjai," he said slowly. "He stopped visiting after some time." Devendra's jaw tightened. "He stopped visiting after I went to the Tehsil office." The words settled heavily between them. "The land was remeasured," Devendra continued. "Officials came, lines were drawn, the map favored us." "Favored," Raghav repeated. Devendra finally turned around. His eyes did not hold anger. They held something closer to shame. "The measurement included that acre within our boundary." Raghav's voice lowered, "But it wasn't ours." Devendra inhaled deeply. The old maps were unclear. The boundary post had rotted. There was no clear stone marker. It became a matter of interpretation. "Interpretation," Raghav echoed. Silence thickened. "Yadavjai protested," Devendra said. "He insisted the neem tree marked the division, that his father had planted it, but the officials measured from a different point, a few feet difference. That is all it takes." Raghav's mind moved back to childhood evenings. The urgent conversation near the cowshed. The older man saying paper can say anything but soil knows. "Did you argue?" Raghav asked carefully. Devendra did not meet his eyes. "I did not object." The sentence was not loud, but it landed heavily. "You could have," Raghav said. "Yes." Another silence. "The bank loan for your sister's wedding," Devendra said slowly. "The second one, we would not have qualified without that extra acre. It increased our valuation." Raghav's heartbeat quickened. "You used that acre as collateral." Devendra nodded once. The room felt airless. "What happened to the Yadavs?" Raghav asked. Devendra's face hardened. "Their son moved to the city for work. Yadavjai fell ill a year later. They sold a portion of their remaining land, then another." "And the acre?" Raghav's voice was barely above a whisper. Devendra closed his eyes briefly. "It remained with us on paper." On paper, Raghav thought of the brass marker buried flat under the neem tree instead of hammered upright, not planted to declare ownership but hidden. "Why didn't you drive it into the ground?" Raghav asked. Devendra's lips trembled slightly. "Because I could not." Outside, wind moved across the fields in restless waves. "You always said land remembers," Raghav said. Devendra gave a hollow, almost humorless smile. "It does." Raghav felt anger rising, but it was tangled with something else, understanding perhaps, or fear. "If the bank forces auction," he said slowly, "that acre will be sold too." Devendra looked at him sharply. "And if it is sold," Raghav continued, "whatever was taken quietly will be transferred permanently to strangers." Devendra said nothing. The sun had fully set by then. Darkness crept into the corners of the room. The brass marker gleamed faintly in the dim light. Raghav felt the weight of something far older than debt pressing against his chest. "You should have corrected it," he said finally. Devendra's voice broke, not loudly, but enough. "At the time, I told myself it was survival, that a few feet of land meant security for my children. That intention mattered." He paused, but intention does not change origin. The tension between them thickened, not just father and son now, but inheritor and witness. "Does Ma know?" Raghav asked. Devendra hesitated. "She knows there was dispute." "But not the rest." "No." Raghav looked at the marker in his father's hand. A small, heavy circle of brass, official, legal, tarnished. Why are you telling me now? He asked. Devendra's eyes drifted toward the fields again, toward the neem tree barely visible in the dark. Because the bank may take everything, he said quietly. And before that happens, you must decide whether you want to defend what I defended or return what I never truly owned. The room fell silent again. Outside, the wind moved through the farmland that had fed them, indebted them, protected them. And somewhere beneath the soil near the neem tree, the earth held its quiet record of a boundary shifted, just enough to change a family's fate. Devendra did not confess fully that night. He carried the truth the way some men carry untreated wounds, wrapped, pressed down, hidden beneath layers of routine. But illness has a way of loosening what pride holds tight. The year before he died, the rains failed completely. The farmland turned from brown to gray. The cracks widened. The bank's patience thinned. Auction notices were printed but not yet posted. Devendra's cough deepened, persistent and dry, as if the dust had settled permanently inside his lungs. He spent more time sitting near the neem tree. Raghav began to understand that his father was not watching the fields anymore. He was watching something else, something only he could see. It was late August when Devendra asked to be taken to the Tehsil office one last time. He was thinner by then, his collarbones sharp against his skin. The doctor in town had used words like complications and limited time, but Devendra had dismissed them with a nod. Raghav drove him in the old tractor because the Jeep had long been sold to repay part of the loan. The Tehsil building had not changed in decades. Faded paint, piles of files tied with cloth tape, ceiling fans that rotated lazily as if conserving energy. Devendra asked to see the land records clerk. The man behind the desk was younger than both of them, uninterested in history, focused only on entries and signatures. "I want to review the original survey maps," Devendra said. The clerk searched, irritated but compliant. He brought out two rolled maps, one from before the remeasurement and one from 34 years ago. They spread them on the desk. The difference was subtle, a slight shift in the boundary line near the neem tree. On the older map, the line curved differently. On the revised one, it straightened, cutting into what had once been marked as Yadav land. "It was corrected after official inspection," the clerk said flatly. "Signed by both parties." Devendra's hand trembled slightly as he pointed to the signature column. There was his name, and beside it, a thumbprint, not a signature. Raghav leaned closer. "Yadavji couldn't read or write," Devendra said quietly. He trusted the explanation given. The clerk shrugged. "If there was objection, it should have been filed then. After 30 years, nothing can be altered without court order." Devendra stared at the thumbprint for a long time. On the drive back, he did not speak. That night, he asked Raghav to bring the iron trunk. Meenakshi was asleep in the adjacent room. The house was silent except for the faint buzz of insects outside. Devendra opened the trunk slowly and removed a folded, yellowed paper Raghav had never seen before. It was not a government document. It was a handwritten letter. "I never destroyed it," Devendra whispered. "I told myself I would answer it." "I never did." Raghav unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, written by someone unaccustomed to long sentences. "Devendra, you know the neem tree was planted by my father when our lands were divided. You know the line was there. The officer measured from the canal stone, not from the tree. I did not argue because you said the paper would reflect fairness, but my heart says this is not right. I am not asking for fight, only asking you to remember truth when you sit on that soil. Raghanath Yadav." Raghav felt heat rise behind his eyes. "What did you tell him?" he asked. Devendra's voice was barely audible. "I told him the government map decides. That sentiment does not change law." "And what did you believe?" Devendra closed his eyes. "That I needed that acre." The confession did not come in anger. It came in exhaustion. "I had just taken the loan for your sister's education," he continued. "Your grandfather's medical bills were unpaid. The harvest had failed that year too. The bank officer told me clearly, without updated measurement, collateral value would not suffice." He coughed, the sound tearing through his chest. "I told myself it was adjustment. That land has shifted boundaries for centuries, that the Yadavs would manage. They still had more than us." He looked at Raghav then, truly looked at him. "But I knew the neem tree had stood there before any officer arrived." The room felt suffocating. Why didn't you correct it later? Raghav demanded softly. After things improved. Devendra gave a hollow laugh. Things never improved enough. He leaned back against the wall, drained. After Raghunath fell ill, his son came once, he continued. He asked me privately if we could remeasure again, not officially, just between families. I told him the matter was settled. Was it? Raghav asked, his voice tightening. No, Devendra whispered. It was silenced. The word hung heavily. He sold half his remaining land to pay for hospital treatment. Then he left for the city. I heard later he works as a security guard. Raghav felt something fracture inside him. All these years, he said, we harvested that acre. Devendra nodded and used it for valuation. Yes. And took loans against it. Yes. And now, Raghav's voice shook. When the bank threatens auction, that acre will be sold permanently, any chance of correction buried. Devendra's eyes filled, not dramatically, but with the slow accumulation of decades. I buried the marker flat because I could not claim it upright, he said. Every time I walked past the neem tree, I felt watched. By whom? Raghav asked. By the man who trusted my word. Silence settled between them, heavy and irreversible. I thought I could carry it, Devendra continued. That I would repay debt and one day quietly transfer it back, but debt grows faster than intention, and pride grows faster than guilt. His breathing grew labored. I signed the will last week, he said suddenly. Raghav stiffened. I gave everything to you because you are strong enough to choose differently. The words hit like a blow. This is not inheritance, Devendra whispered. It is decision. Raghav felt anger surge, at the bank, at the drought, at poverty. But most of all at the quiet arithmetic his father had performed decades ago. You want me to undo it? He asked. I want you to decide, Devendra said. If we keep it, we survive with stain. If we return it, we risk losing everything. His voice broke fully then. I stole in daylight with paperwork, he said, and called it survival. Tears slid down his face, not violently but steadily. Raghav had never seen his father cry. Outside, wind moved through the dying crops. Inside, the truth stood exposed, no longer subtle, no longer implied. An acre taken not by force but by silence. An inheritance not of wealth, but of moral debt. The morning after Devendra's funeral, the farmland looked almost peaceful. Ash from the cremation still clung faintly to Raghav's clothes. The rituals had ended. Relatives had returned to their own concerns. Only immediate family remained, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of grief. The bank notice arrived 3 days later. It was not dramatic. A single envelope, official seal, calm language outlining pending recovery proceedings. If outstanding dues were not cleared within 60 days, the property listed as collateral, including the full 12 acres, would proceed toward auction. Raghav read the document twice. 12 acres, not 11. On paper, there had never been dispute. He folded the notice carefully and placed it on the iron trunk. That evening, he walked to the neem tree. The soil there was dry, cracked in thin veins. He stood where his father had once dug quietly under lantern light. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then he fetched a spade. It did not take long to find the brass survey marker. The earth, even hardened by drought, gave way as if it had been waiting. When he lifted it out, it was heavier than he remembered, caked in soil, tarnished further by time. He cleaned it with the edge of his shirt and stared at the engraved government seal. Official, legal, incomplete. The next morning, he went to the neighboring hamlet. The Yadav house stood smaller than memory suggested. The outer wall had collapsed partially. A tin sheet covered one side of the roof. An elderly woman opened the door, Raghunath's wid. She recognized him immediately. You have your father's face, she said without warmth. I came to speak to your son, Raghav replied. He is in the city, she said. Comes once in 2 months. I will wait. He waited on the low boundary wall until late afternoon when a bus dropped off a thin man in a faded uniform shirt. The security company logo had nearly washed away. The man stopped when he saw Raghav. I know why you're here, he said flatly. Do you? Raghav asked. Yes, the bank is auctioning your land. Raghav nodded. They stood facing each other in the dust. My father told me everything before he died, Raghav said quietly. The man's jaw tightened. And he left the decision to me. A dry laugh escaped the man. Decision. It was decided 34 years ago. Raghav pulled the brass marker from his bag. I found this buried under the neem tree. For the first time, something shifted in the man's expression. Not hope, not anger, something more cautious. You came to return an object, he asked. No, Raghav said. I came to return an acre. Silence, even the wind seemed to pause. The bank has listed all 12 acres as collateral, Raghav continued. If auction proceeds, everything goes, but before that happens, I can file correction, voluntary boundary revision. It will reduce my landholding to 11 acres. The valuation will drop. The bank will not recover full amount. They may still auction, but legally that acre will not be mine. The man stared at him. You will lose more, he said slowly. Yes. You may lose everything. Yes. Your mother, he asked. She knows enough. The man looked past Raghav, toward the distant outline of the neem tree barely visible from where they stood. My father waited for you to come, he said quietly, for years. I know, Raghav replied. Why now? The man asked, not accusing, simply asking. Raghav searched for an answer that was not theatrical. Because inheritance is not only land, he said finally. It is also what you refuse to carry forward. The paperwork was not simple. The Tehsil office required applications, affidavits, joint statements. The bank manager was furious when informed. He warned Raghav bluntly. You are reducing your own collateral value, he said. Do you understand the consequence? Yes. You will not qualify for restructuring. Yes. You may be forcing auction. Yes. The manager leaned back, frustrated. Why would you do this? Raghav did not mention guilt. He did not mention his father's tears. He simply said, because it was never ours. Word spread quickly. In Bharavpur, morality is admired in theory and questioned in practice. Some called him foolish. Others said grief had clouded his judgment. An uncle accused him privately of betraying family interest. Your father fought for that land, the uncle said sharply. He fought for survival, Raghav replied, not for theft. His mother did not argue. She watched quietly as officials came to remeasure. This time the brass marker was hammered upright into the soil beside the neem tree. Publicly, clearly, no burying, the line shifted back. 1 acre less. The bank recalculated. The numbers no longer worked in Raghav's favor. Without the additional valuation, the restructuring proposal collapsed. Auction proceedings moved forward. On the day of auction notice being posted at the gate, a small crowd gathered again, just as they had during the will reading. But this time there was no fire. There was only paper nailed to wood. The farmland would be sold in lots. Raghav stood before it without expression. The Yadav's son stood a few feet away, silent. In the weeks that followed, parcels of the land were purchased by a logistics company expanding from the highway. Machines arrived. Surveyors marked grids. The old house would be demolished within months. Raghav retained the 11 acres only briefly before the sale concluded. He and his mother moved into a smaller rented home near the market road. It was not dramatic. No one applauded. Some shook their heads. Some avoided eye contact. But on the afternoon when the new boundary was finalized, the Yadav's son came to the neem tree alone. He placed his palm against its trunk and closed his eyes briefly. Raghav watched from a distance. The land no longer belonged to either of them fully. Development would swallow most of it within years. Warehouses would stand where crops once grew, yet the acre near the neem tree had been corrected before transfer. Its history amended even if too late to restore what was lost. One evening, weeks after moving, Raghav returned quietly to the edge of the property. Machines had begun clearing brush. Dust hung in the air. He stood near the boundary where the brass marker now stood upright, visible, undeniable. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel ruined. He felt lighter. His father had once said a man can inherit land, but not innocence. Raghav understood now that innocence is not inherited. Only accountability is. As the sun set behind the half-cleared fields, casting long shadows over soil that had changed hands too many times, Raghav turned away without ceremony. The land would feed someone else now. but the truth beneath it no longer belonged to silence, because land can be measured in acres and sold in auctions. But moral debt, once acknowledged, is the only inheritance that does not multiply.